The courtroom in Monterey County was filled to capacity, the air thick with anticipation. People murmured among themselves, eager to witness a spectacle unlike anything they had ever seen before. It wasn't just any legal battle unfolding today. It was Clint Eastwood, a Hollywood icon, a legend, standing at the plaintiff's table. The usual whispers and chatter that accompany high-profile cases were amplified in this instance, as some tried to elbow their neighbors to get a better view, while others silently recorded the event on their phones. Outside, news vans were stationed along the street, satellite dishes pointed toward the sky, ready to beam any juicy developments to the world. Clint Eastwood, known for facing countless villains on the big screen, was now facing an entirely different kind of adversary, the legal system itself. His lawsuit was a simple one. A real estate developer named Gerald Madsen had encroached on Clint's property in Carmel by the sea, building a luxury condominium where it didn't belong. Clint had tried to handle the matter civilly at first, sending letters, making calls, issuing formal complaints, but his warnings had fallen on deaf ears. Now Clint was in court, prepared to argue his own case. The courtroom was electric with the intensity of the moment, and when Judge Wallace Bridger, a portly man in his 60s, entered the room, the atmosphere shifted. He adjusted his glasses, sizing up Clint, who stood at the plaintiff's table, composed and unwavering. A slight smirk tugged at the corners of the judge's lips as he eyed the Hollywood star. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge began, tapping his gavel, his tone tinged with amusement, "I understand you've chosen to represent yourself in this matter." Clint, standing tall despite his 94 years, simply nodded, his piercing blue eyes locked with the judge's. "That's right." A ripple of laughter swept through the courtroom. Some of the spectators were incredulous. Others found the situation amusing, and even Madsen, sitting at the defense table with his high-powered attorney, couldn't help but chuckle. Judge Bridger leaned forward, the smirk on his face growing wider. "You do understand that legal proceedings are a bit different from what you might be used to in Hollywood?" The judge continued, his voice dripping with mockery. "There are rules, procedures. It's not just about delivering a line and riding off into the sunset." The laughter grew louder. Some reporters scribbled notes furiously, while one even whispered, "This is going to be gold." Everyone seemed to think they were in for a show, but Clint didn't flinch. He let the laughter echo around him, waiting for the room to settle before responding. "I know the rules, Your Honor, and I know the law," Clint said, his voice calm and measured. Judge Bridger raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Oh? And where did you study law, Mr. Eastwood?" The courtroom erupted in laughter again. This time, Clint didn't react. He simply reached into his case file, pulled out a neatly bound stack of documents, and placed them on the table before him. "I've spent the last 6 months reviewing every property law that applies to this case. I've read the local zoning codes, studied precedent, and I have enough evidence to prove that my land has been unlawfully encroached upon," Clint said, tapping the top page lightly. "Now I'm here to present that evidence. If this court is about justice, let's get to it." For the first time, the laughter died down. A hush fell over the courtroom as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Clint Eastwood wasn't here for theatrics. He wasn't here to entertain. He was here to win. Judge Bridger cleared his throat, suddenly aware of his earlier mockery. "Very well, Mr. Eastwood," he said, his tone more measured now. "Let's proceed." The court had just been given a glimpse of something unexpected. Clint Eastwood was no ordinary man, and this was no ordinary case. The stakes were higher than anyone had anticipated, and the courtroom was about to find out just how serious Clint was about seeing justice done. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. The whispers had turned into an uneasy silence as Clint Eastwood stood before Judge Bridger, ready to present his case. The spectators, who had expected an entertaining spectacle, now sat on the edge of their seats, intrigued by what they might see. Even Madsen's high-powered attorney, Gerald Parker, appeared slightly more guarded. Judge Bridger, who had initially underestimated Clint, now leaned back in his chair, awaiting the opening statement. The courtroom felt like a movie set, but this time, there were no scripts, no rehearsed lines, just the raw tension of real-life justice. "Mr. Eastwood," Judge Bridger said, his voice stern but with a hint of curiosity, You may proceed with your opening statement. Clint stood tall, his hands resting lightly on the table in front of him. He didn't rush, giving the room a moment of silence. It was a trick he had mastered in countless films, letting the weight of his presence settle before speaking. In 1992, I purchased a stretch of land in Carmel by the sea. Clint began, his voice steady and deliberate, carrying the kind of calm authority that only years of experience could bring. The property lines were clearly documented. Over the years, I've maintained the land, paid taxes on it, and ensured it was kept in line with local regulations. He paused for a beat, letting the room absorb his words. But last year, Clint continued, his voice hardening slightly, Mr. Madsen and his company decided my property wasn't mine anymore. They built on my land without my consent, ignored the boundaries, ignored permits, ignored me. The courtroom was still now. The murmurs of the crowd quieted as Clint laid out his case. I sent formal warnings, legal notices, and requests to cease construction, he said, his tone unwavering. They ignored those too. Clint reached into his case file and pulled out a series of aerial photographs, placing them carefully on the table in front of him. He pointed to one of the images, showing the land before construction had begun. This is my property in 2021, Clint explained, his finger tracing the boundaries clearly marked on the photo. And this, he said, sliding another photo forward, is my property in 2023. You can see the development creeping into my land. The courtroom was now completely silent. Even Madsen's attorney, Parker, had stopped writing notes. The evidence was undeniable. Clint didn't need to yell. He didn't need to make a spectacle of himself. He simply presented the facts. This is the pattern, Clint continued, his voice cool and precise. Mr. Madsen's company has been building on my land without my permission, and after multiple attempts to resolve this issue outside of court, here I am. He pulled out more documents from his file, each one reinforcing his argument. This, Clint said, holding up a series of emails and letters, is a record of every attempt I made to resolve this issue before bringing it to court. They had every opportunity to do the right thing. They chose not to. For the first time, Judge Bridger's demeanor shifted. The mocking tone he had used earlier was gone. His expression was more serious now, and his eyes lingered on Clint for a moment longer than necessary. Mr. Parker, Judge Bridger said, addressing Madsen's attorney, you may respond. Parker, who had been exuding confidence up until this point, now hesitated. He had expected Clint to falter, to be unprepared. But instead, Clint had methodically dismantled any assumptions that had been made about him. Parker straightened his tie, collected himself, and stood to address the court. Your Honor, Parker began smoothly, I have to give Mr. Eastwood credit for his dedication. But with all due respect, the legal process is far more complicated than this. Property disputes aren't resolved by simply reading a few law books. There are nuances, precedents, and interpretations that must be taken into account. He turned to Clint with a smirk. Mr. Eastwood is certainly a well-versed man, but I think we can all agree that legal matters require a bit more expertise than he's shown. The courtroom stirred with soft chuckles and glances exchanged between the spectators. Madsen's legal team seemed confident again, assuming the upper hand, but Clint didn't flinch. He remained calm, his eyes locked onto Parker's. He wasn't here to entertain. He wasn't here to put on a show. I understand the law just fine, Clint replied, his voice steady but carrying an edge. And I understand when someone is breaking it. The tension in the room heightened. The laughter that had filled the courtroom moments earlier died down, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that Clint Eastwood wasn't the naive, bumbling actor they had expected. He was a man who had spent decades in the public eye, and he had done his homework. Judge Bridger, who had initially thought this case would be a simple display of celebrity hubris, now found himself questioning his own assumptions. The courtroom, once full of mockery and amusement, was now sober with the weight of Clint's words. Very well, Judge Bridger said, clearing his throat. Mr. Eastwood, you may proceed. Clint took his seat, his face unreadable, but there was one thing that had become crystal clear. This wasn't going to be the train wreck everyone had anticipated. Clint Eastwood was no ordinary man, and this was no ordinary case. The courtroom settled into an uneasy silence as Clint Eastwood took his seat. The spectators, many of whom had expected to see the aging actor stumble through legal proceedings, now watched with rapt attention. Clint's opening statement had thrown the room off balance, and the reality of the case was beginning to sink in. This was no longer about an actor in a courtroom. It was about a man fighting for what was right, using the law as his weapon. Judge Bridger leaned back in his chair, clearly intrigued, but his stern demeanor remained. He glanced at Madsen's lawyer, Gerald Parker, who stood, adjusting his expensive suit as he prepared to respond. Parker, who had appeared confident earlier, now seemed a bit more cautious, aware that Clint's arguments had struck a nerve. With a deep breath, Parker began his rebuttal. "Your Honor," Parker began, his voice smooth and calculated, "while we certainly respect Mr. Eastwood's passion, we must be clear about one fundamental point. Legal matters, particularly property disputes, are far more complex than the way Mr. Eastwood has presented them." He turned to face Clint, an air of condescension creeping into his tone. "You see, property law is about more than just documents and photographs. It's about interpretation, precedent, and most importantly, expertise. And with all due respect to Mr. Eastwood, he is not an attorney." The spectators shifted uneasily in their seats. Some of them exchanged glances, others whispered among themselves. But Clint didn't respond. He simply sat quietly, his blue eyes fixed on Parker, unwavering. Parker continued, sensing an opportunity to regain the upper hand. "Mr. Eastwood has done an admirable job of assembling some documents, but as anyone with experience in law can tell you, understanding legal nuances takes more than just reading property codes and zoning laws. It takes years of practice, years of working in the field. That's why we have experts, lawyers who have spent their careers learning the law and interpreting it." He gestured toward Madsen, who sat confidently at the defense table. "My client, Mr. Madsen, followed every legal requirement to the best of his ability. If there was an error, it was unintentional, a misunderstanding of the property boundaries, nothing more. And while Mr. Eastwood is certainly a talented man, his understanding of legal complexities falls short." Clint's expression remained unreadable as Parker's words echoed in the room. He wasn't the type to engage in unnecessary back and forth, and he wasn't about to let the lawyer's theatrics distract him. Instead, he calmly glanced at Judge Bridger, waiting for the judge's ruling on how the case would proceed. Judge Bridger, who had been listening intently, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Mr. Parker, you've made your point, but I think Mr. Eastwood's position has also been made clear. Mr. Eastwood, do you wish to respond?" Clint didn't hesitate. Standing slowly, he adjusted his coat and walked toward the witness stand. He didn't grab any documents or glance at his notes. He simply stood there, the same calm, collected figure the courtroom had come to recognize. He rested his hands on the table and locked eyes with Parker. "You're right about one thing," Clint said, his voice low but firm. "This isn't a movie, and in real life, the facts are what matter most, not opinions, not interpretations. The law is about standing up for what's right." He glanced at Judge Bridger. "And I'm here to do that." The room grew still. Parker opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, clearly taken aback by Clint's directness. Clint wasn't playing a role. He wasn't here to make a spectacle of the situation. He was simply presenting the truth, and that truth was undeniable. "I understand the law just fine," Clint continued, his tone unwavering. "And I understand when someone is breaking it. Mr. Madsen may think he can bulldoze over my property and get away with it, but that's not how this works." Parker, momentarily rattled, regained his composure and moved to the defense table. He straightened his tie, collecting himself. "Your Honor," he said, addressing Judge Bridger, "I would like to present my client's case now. We have a team of legal experts who will show that the construction was in line with all applicable regulations." Clint didn't respond. Instead, he sat back down, his gaze steady. The room, once filled with laughter and skepticism, was now eerily quiet. The defense's confidence was starting to erode, piece by piece. Judge Bridger nodded, signaling for Parker to proceed, but even he seemed to be weighing the strength of Clint's arguments. "Very well, Mr. Parker," the judge said. "Proceed with your witness." The defense called their first witness, a property surveyor who had worked on Madsen's development project. As the witness stepped to the stand, Clint sat back, arms folded, his eyes sharp and focused. He knew this wasn't going to be an easy fight, but every move he made, every piece of evidence he presented, was pushing the case closer to the truth. The witness spoke at length, detailing the technical aspects of property surveys and the legal procedures followed by Madsen's company. But Clint wasn't interested in the technicalities. He had his own facts, facts that painted a very different picture of the situation, and when the time came, he would reveal them. As the defense continued to present its case, Clint's mind was already working through the next phase of his strategy. He wasn't in a rush. The truth had a way of making itself known, and he intended to let it speak for itself. Outside the courtroom, reporters were already buzzing with excitement. Word had spread quickly. Clint Eastwood was no longer just a Hollywood legend. He was a man taking on the legal system and demanding justice. Whether they liked it or not, the courtroom was about to witness something that no one had expected. A battle between a Hollywood icon and the corporate giants who thought they could operate with impunity. And Clint Eastwood wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The defense's witness, a seasoned property surveyor, had just finished his testimony, offering an account that seemed to back Madsen's position. He spoke with authority, detailing the steps his team had taken to assess the property lines. But as he spoke, Clint sat quietly at his table, his gaze fixed on the witness stand. The jury, initially skeptical, was now leaning forward, waiting to see how Clint would respond. They could sense the subtle shift in momentum. Clint had already shown them he wasn't playing the part of an ill-prepared actor, fumbling through legal jargon. He was here to win, and the defense's case was beginning to show cracks. Clint had already collected the evidence needed to turn the tide in his favor. As the surveyor took his seat, Clint stood, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were stepping into a scene he had rehearsed many times before. He didn't need notes, didn't need any reminders. He had lived and breathed this case for months. Every detail was etched in his mind, and now it was time to let the truth unfold. "Mr. Reynolds," Clint began, addressing the witness with the same steady, measured voice that had captivated the courtroom from the beginning. "You've been a land surveyor for how long?" 35 years, Reynolds replied, his voice confident but not without a hint of uncertainty in his eyes as he glanced at Clint. "Over those 35 years," Clint continued, "have you seen property disputes where the boundaries were misinterpreted? I mean, cases where surveys were inaccurate or where mistakes were made in the legal documents?" The room grew quiet. The surveyor shifted in his seat, his confidence waning as Clint pressed him further. "Well, yes," Reynolds admitted. "I've seen cases where boundaries were unclear or where surveys didn't match up with the legal description. But that's not the case here." Clint nodded slowly. "I understand. But are you saying that there was any confusion about the boundary lines of my property? About where my land ends and Mr. Madsen's development begins?" Reynolds hesitated for a moment before answering. "No," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "The boundaries were clear. There was no mistake." Clint leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving the witness. "So, to be clear," Clint said, his voice firm, "you're telling this court that the property lines were correct and that the development on my land was in line with those boundaries?" Reynolds' expression faltered. He shifted again, a bead of sweat forming on his brow. "Yes," he said, but there was an edge of uncertainty now, a crack in his earlier confidence. Clint didn't give him a chance to recover. He reached into his case file and pulled out the aerial photographs, the same ones he had presented earlier, the ones that clearly showed the encroachment on his property. He placed them on the table before him, aligning the photographs so the jury could clearly see the difference before and after the construction began. "These are aerial photos of my property," Clint said, his tone calm but with an undeniable weight. "This one shows the land in 2021, before any construction began, and this one shows the land in 2023. As you can see, the boundaries haven't changed. But something else has." He pointed at the area of the photograph where Madsen's development had spilled over the line. "This is where the development has gone beyond the boundaries. This is where the law was ignored." Reynolds opened his mouth to speak, but Clint wasn't finished. "You see," Clint continued, "it's not just a matter of interpretation. The law is clear. These boundaries are documented, legally recorded, and the development was built on land that didn't belong to Mr. Madsen. Clint turned to face the jury, his gaze steady. You've heard Mr. Reynolds speak about how property lines can sometimes be blurry, but you've also seen the evidence. You've seen the photos, the records, and the fact that this development wasn't a mistake. It was an intentional act. The courtroom was silent. Clint had delivered his punch, and now it was time for the defense to react. Parker, visibly rattled by Clint's direct approach, stood up from his chair, his expression tight with frustration. Your Honor, Parker interjected, I would like to request that we focus on the specific details of this case, not grandiose assumptions or accusations about intent. Clint didn't flinch. This isn't a grandiose accusation, he replied evenly. It's a fact backed up by evidence. My land was taken without permission. That's not an accident. That's not a misunderstanding. That's theft. Judge Bridger, who had been quiet throughout Clint's questioning, now turned his attention to Parker. Mr. Parker, he said, his tone more serious than before, you've heard the evidence. Do you wish to cross-examine the witness? Parker hesitated, clearly agitated by Clint's unrelenting approach. He opened his mouth but then closed it, seemingly at a loss for words. Finally, he shook his head. No further questions, Your Honor. Clint sat back down, his face unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a glimmer of satisfaction. He had done his part. The ball was now in the defense's court. Judge Bridger looked around the room, his expression somber. The energy in the courtroom had changed. It was no longer a spectacle. It was a fight for justice. Clint Eastwood had stepped into the ring, and he wasn't backing down. Madsen's legal team, now visibly shaken, huddled together in a quiet corner of the courtroom, murmuring in urgent tones. The defense's confidence had evaporated. What had seemed like a straightforward case for them was now unraveling piece by piece. But Clint didn't seem concerned by the whispering behind him. He was calm, composed, knowing that the facts had already spoken for themselves. The court had seen enough to know that the truth was on his side. As the defense prepared to call their next witness, Clint took a deep breath and adjusted the papers in front of him. He was ready for whatever came next. The battle wasn't over yet, but he could feel it in the air. The tide was turning in his favor. For the first time, the defense realized they were up against more than just a Hollywood actor. They were up against a man who knew how to fight for what was right, both in front of the camera and behind the courtroom bench. The courtroom was tense. The defense had just finished presenting their case, and now it was Clint Eastwood's turn to finish what he had started. The evidence was stacking up in his favor, and the cracks in the defense's arguments were becoming more apparent with every witness. Clint had managed to maintain control of the room, his methodical and calm approach continuing to unnerve Madsen's team. Clint sat back in his chair, arms crossed, as he observed the defense's next move. Gerald Madsen, the real estate mogul who had once walked into the courtroom with a cocky confidence, was now visibly sweating. His face had lost the sharpness it once had, replaced by a look of growing concern. The courtroom, once buzzing with noise and chatter, was now unnervingly silent. Even the reporters in the back were hushed, waiting for the next big moment to unfold. Judge Bridger, who had been paying closer attention than anyone expected, cleared his throat and turned toward Madsen's legal team. Mr. Parker, you may proceed with your next witness. Parker, clearly unsettled by the progress Clint had made, stood up slowly, his movements tense. He had no more theatrics left in his playbook. This trial, which had begun with a smirk and a sense of superiority, was beginning to feel like a nightmare. His shoulders slumped slightly as he walked toward the witness stand. We call James Whitaker to the stand, Parker announced. James Whitaker, a senior land assessor in his early 60s, walked up to the witness stand. His hair was thinning, and his face carried the weight of years spent in the field. He looked like someone who was used to answering tough questions, but even he seemed to know that this wasn't going to be an ordinary case. Whitaker was sworn in, and Parker began his questioning. Mr. Whitaker, Parker began, you've been a land assessor for how long? 35 years, Whitaker answered, his voice steady. During those 35 years, have you ever encountered situations where property boundaries were misinterpreted? Parker asked, clearly attempting to establish that errors could have been made, even unintentionally. Oh yes, Whitaker replied. Property disputes happen more often than you'd think. Sometimes boundaries can be misinterpreted due to outdated surveys or legal descriptions that no longer match the land as it is. Clint remained silent, his face unreadable, but his mind was already working. This witness, much like the others, would soon reveal the truth that the defense desperately tried to suppress. Parker nodded and turned to the jury. So Mr. Eastwood's claim that his property was unlawfully encroached upon could be the result of a simple misunderstanding. In property law, things aren't always as clear-cut as Mr. Eastwood would have you believe. Clint's eyes narrowed as he stood slowly, walking to the witness stand. He wasn't going to let this narrative stand unchallenged. The room shifted in energy as everyone turned their attention to him. He didn't rush, but instead took his time, approaching Whitaker with the same calm, deliberate pace that had defined his entire approach to the case. Mr. Whitaker, Clint began, his voice steady, you've been a land assessor for 35 years, right? That's correct, Whitaker replied. I'm sure you've seen all kinds of property disputes, Clint continued. But in your experience, have you ever come across a case where a development company has knowingly built over property lines, even when they knew it wasn't their land? The question hung in the air. Whitaker shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced over at Madsen, then at Parker, as if searching for reassurance. But there was none. I can't say that I've ever seen a case exactly like that, Whitaker admitted, his voice faltering slightly. Clint nodded slowly, as if the answer had been expected. But I'm sure you've seen situations where property lines were, let's say, pushed by a developer, either knowingly or unknowingly. Whitaker hesitated, then nodded. Yes, it happens. Sometimes developers do things without fully accounting for property lines. But in this case, Clint didn't let him finish. He reached into his stack of evidence and pulled out a document, a record of previous property disputes involving Madsen Development Corporation. He held it up for the jury to see, making sure everyone could take in the significance of the evidence. I'd like you to take a look at this, Mr. Whitaker, Clint said calmly. This is a record of 5 previous property disputes involving Madsen Development Corporation. 5 cases where property boundaries were violated. How many of those disputes were settled out of court? Whitaker blinked and adjusted his glasses, then took the document. His face tensed as he scanned the page. All of them, he muttered. All 5 were settled out of court. Clint's eyes never left the witness as he spoke. So, we're not talking about simple mistakes, are we, Mr. Whitaker? This is a pattern, a history of pushing property lines, of paying to settle disputes quietly, and of disregarding the law when it's convenient. Whitaker opened his mouth, but no words came out. The defense's entire argument was crumbling, piece by piece, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Clint turned slowly, addressing the jury with a calm but piercing gaze. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a pattern of behavior, a history of knowing where the property lines are and choosing to ignore them. And in this case, Mr. Madsen thought he could get away with it again. The room was silent. The tension had shifted. Madsen's legal team, now visibly rattled, exchanged quick, desperate looks. Their own witness had just admitted to a pattern of violations, and Clint's words had made it crystal clear. This wasn't just about one mistake. It was about a deliberate attempt to steal from him. Clint didn't need to say more. He simply turned to the judge. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Bridger nodded slowly, as if processing everything that had just transpired. The room remained still, the weight of Clint's words hanging in the air. Parker, unable to recover from the blow Clint had just delivered, stood up slowly. Your Honor, I would like to request a brief recess to reconsider our strategy. Judge Bridger didn't hesitate. Denied. You've had ample time to present your case. We'll proceed with closing arguments. The defense's attempt to delay was futile. The truth had already been exposed, and Clint Eastwood had just delivered the knockout punch. As the court adjourned for the day, reporters scrambled outside to gather the latest updates. The news had spread quickly. Clint Eastwood wasn't just a Hollywood legend. He was now a man who had taken on a powerful corporation and was winning. Inside the courtroom, Madsen sat slumped in his chair, his face pale and his eyes filled with frustration. The fight was over, and he knew it. He had underestimated Clint Eastwood, and now he was about to pay the price. Clint, meanwhile, sat quietly, his face calm, but his eyes alive with determination. The battle wasn't over yet, but it was clear to everyone that Clint had already won the most important round. The rest was just a formality. The truth had come to light, and there was no hiding from it anymore. The following morning, the courtroom was packed once again. The buzz from the previous day's proceedings had reached a fever pitch. Reporters filled the gallery, their cameras trained on Clint Eastwood as he sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, his calm demeanor unwavering. Madsen, who had once been the embodiment of confidence, now sat hunched in his chair, his face a mask of frustration. The once self-assured businessman had been brought to his knees by the truth. His smugness had evaporated, and all that remained was the reality that he had been caught. The air was thick with anticipation. Today would be the final act, and all eyes were on the jury. Their deliberation had taken hours, and the weight of their decision could not be underestimated. The defense had failed to present a viable argument. Clint had systematically dismantled every piece of their case with unflinching precision, and now it was time for the jury to decide. Judge Bridger entered the room, his gavel tapping against the desk with authority. "Court is now in session," he declared. Everyone stood, the room hushed. The foreman of the jury, a composed woman in her early 40s, walked to the front, carrying the manila envelope that contained the verdict. With a steady hand, Judge Bridger took the envelope, opening it and scanning its contents. The courtroom was still, the only sound the shuffling of papers. Finally, the judge looked up, his voice calm but resonating with the gravity of the moment. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Clint Eastwood," Judge Bridger read aloud, his tone firm. "We find that the defendant, Gerald Madsen, and Madsen Development Corporation knowingly encroached upon Mr. Eastwood's property. The defendant is hereby ordered to pay full compensation for the damages incurred by the plaintiff, as well as additional punitive damages for willful disregard of property law." The room erupted into a mixture of disbelief and admiration. Reporters' pens flew across their notepads, scribbling down the headlines that were practically writing themselves. Clint Eastwood, Hollywood legend, had won the case, not through theatrics, not through celebrity status, but through the undeniable power of truth and evidence. He had faced down a powerful adversary, and the system had worked in his favor. Madsen sat motionless, his face drained of color. His attorney, Parker, had no words left. They had lost, and they had lost badly. There was no appeal that could undo what had just been decided. Clint remained calm, a slight nod the only sign of acknowledgement as the judge finalized the ruling. He had been prepared for this moment. He had studied the law, gathered the evidence, and fought not just for himself, but for justice. This was not the victory of a man seeking fame or recognition. It was the victory of a man demanding what was rightfully his, and in doing so, setting an example for everyone who had ever been wronged and ignored. As Judge Bridger called the court to adjourn, Clint stood, straightening his coat and walking slowly toward the exit. The world outside would be waiting, but Clint didn't need to stay for the spectacle. He had already won, and his mission was complete. The reporters swarmed around him as he stepped outside, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in his direction. The questions came fast and furious, but Clint didn't engage with them immediately. He stood for a moment in the sunlight, the cool breeze brushing against his face. Then, with his usual quiet dignity, he spoke. "Justice was served today," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "Not because I'm Clint Eastwood, but because the truth was on my side. When you stand up for what's right, you don't need to fight dirty. You just need to stand your ground." With those words, Clint Eastwood walked away from the courthouse, not as a Hollywood icon, but as a man who had proven that sometimes the law is not just about who you are, but what you stand for. Lesson from the story. The story of Clint Eastwood's legal battle is not just about a celebrity taking on a powerful corporation. It is a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up for what is right, regardless of the odds. Throughout the trial, Clint's approach was never about showmanship or public spectacle. Instead, it was about quiet determination, preparation, and the courage to face an adversary that many thought he could not defeat. The first lesson is the value of preparation. Clint spent months studying the law, gathering evidence, and understanding the legal landscape before stepping into the courtroom. He didn't rely on his fame or charisma to win. He relied on hard work and knowledge. Whether in a legal case, a business venture, or any challenge in life, preparation is the key to success. The second lesson is the power of truth. Clint didn't try to twist the facts or manipulate the system. He simply presented the truth, backed by undeniable evidence. In a world where manipulation and deceit often seem to prevail, Clint's story teaches us that honesty and integrity are powerful tools. In the end, the truth won out over wealth, power, and arrogance. The final lesson is the importance of standing your ground. Clint Eastwood could have easily settled for a payout, as Madsen had expected, but instead he chose to fight for what was rightfully his. In doing so, he not only secured his own victory, but also sent a message to anyone who had ever been wronged that they too could stand up and demand justice. Clint's victory in the courtroom is a testament to the idea that no matter how powerful or wealthy an opponent may be, justice can still prevail when we are armed with the truth and the courage to stand up for it.